Golly, what a passage. That's a tough act to follow. We'll try nonetheless. When I was in my early 20s, so about 30 seconds ago, really, it was about 6 years ago, it was 2019, I started developing some occasional tooth pain. I started to develop sort of some occasional toothaches. It was particularly on one side of my mouth, on this side of my mouth. And so what did I do? How did I respond to these toothaches? Well, I did like any good young guy does. I ignored it. I just went, you know what? It'll go away on its own. I'm going to leave it. I'm going to let it be. I remember occasionally I mentioned it to Mum, and she went, "Oh, just make an appointment. It's not hard. Just make an appointment. It's probably not serious, but just get it looked at." But going to the dentist seemed inconvenient. It seemed expensive. And there's also that sort of thought about, like, what if something really is wrong? What if something needs serious work done? It's easier to just take some painkillers and just hope it'll go away. So I kept putting it off week after week, month after month. Over time, it got worse. I found that I would be avoiding certain foods sometimes, occasionally you'd bite into a crouton in a salad and you go, "Oh, gee, that's a bit painful." Chew only on one side of the mouth. But I didn't think about it. It'll go away, surely. It'll go away eventually if I just leave it. Well, one day I woke up and the pain was just unbearable. It was still to this day was the worst pain that I've felt. And if you've had really bad tooth pain, you'll know the kind of pain that I'm talking about. It really felt like someone was just hammering a nail into my jaw. It was just horrible. I couldn't eat at all. I couldn't really concentrate. I couldn't function. I was just completely out of it. I had no other option really but to just book in a dentist appointment as soon as I could. And what I discovered was that my wisdom teeth were coming through, and they had been putting a lot of pressure on the molar near one of them. One of the molars had a lot of pressure on it. And the dentist looked at the x-rays, and I remember the tone that she used. And you might know this tone, the sort of tone that dentists in particular seem to be experts at. It's that sort of like that caring, gentle tone, but just with the right amount of indignation, about just the right amount of like, "Oh, now listen." And she said essentially that if I'd come in when the pain had first started, then it probably wouldn't have been that big a deal. Maybe would have needed the wisdom teeth out, but it would have been okay. But because I'd waited so long, because I'd sat on my hands for 6 months, and it had been about that long, I was going to need a root canal to fix the damaged molar, or I could just have it removed. And I didn't really want to lose one of my molars, so I went through with the root canal, which was a painful process. What should have been really a straightforward procedure became really complex. It took months to resolve, and I was in pain for quite a while. And you might imagine it wasn't cheap to have a root canal done. It was expensive, which ultimately caused more pain. My decision to delay having my teeth looked at just made everything more painful and more costly. Well, this morning we're continuing our series in the Gospel of Luke. We're travelling with Jesus. And in our passage this morning, Jesus delivers some inconvenient truths that it might be tempting to ignore, or it might be tempting to skip over. He says things that don't seem to fit our comfortable image of Jesus. He talks about bringing fire. He talks about bringing division. He seems almost eager for it. He challenges people for missing obvious spiritual realities. Hypocrites, he says. It's not the sanitized, sweet image of Jesus that we're used to. So what are these inconvenient truths? Well, I want you to have a think back to, if you can remember, the first time that you heard about Jesus, whether you were a child, a teenager, or an adult. What did you expect him to be like the very first time you heard about Jesus? Most of us probably expected someone gentle, someone peaceful, someone who would make our lives easier, not harder, someone who would bring families together. It's the same Jesus that we see on Christmas cards. sort of calm image of Jesus, serene, got a peaceful smile on his face. But in the passage today, we listen to what Jesus says about his mission. And it's almost like it's directed right at those of us that have that calm and gentle vision of Jesus. He says, I have come to bring fire on the earth, and how I wish it were already kindled. Do you think I came to bring peace on earth? He feels like he's aiming it at us. Do you think I came to bring peace on earth? No, I tell you, but division. This doesn't sound like the Jesus that we signed up for. But Jesus is being completely honest about what his presence in the world actually does. He brings fire, a fire of crisis, a fire of decision, a fire that forces us to choose. What does fire do, if we think about it? Fire never leaves something unchanged. It depends on the context, but fire might destroy, but in other contexts it might purify. But it never leaves things the same way that they were. When Jesus shows up in a life, in a family, being neutral is no longer an option. His truth creates a crisis that demands a response. And Jesus doesn't apologize for this. He seems eager for it. How I wish it were already kindled, that fire. The division isn't an unfortunate side effect of his ministry. It's somehow central to it. And Jesus gets specific about it. There will be 5 in one family divided against each other, 3 against 2, 2 against 3, father against son, son against father, mother against daughter. Jesus is saying that his truth is going to split families right down the middle. The most intimate relationships that we have, parent and child, husband and wife, these will be affected by people's response to him. And it's not an accident, it's inevitable. Why? Well, Jesus doesn't ask us to add him to our existing life like a nice accessory, just a nice little addition. He asks us to make him Lord of our life, which means that some things that used to be Lord need to be dethroned. And when we choose Jesus over other loyalties, even family loyalties, conflict becomes unavoidable. And this is what it might mean for us. And this is hard. This passage is hard to wrestle with. If following Jesus isn't creating any tension in our lives, we might not actually be living our lives the way Jesus wants us to. If following Jesus isn't creating tension in our lives, we might not be living the lives Jesus wants us to. And this is a hard thing to grapple with. If our faith fitted perfectly into our existing relationships, our priorities and our lifestyles without friction, something's probably wrong. Jesus brings fire because truth is inherently divisive. When light enters a dark room, it exposes things. And when truth encounters lies, conflict happens. When the kingdom of God encounters our kingdoms of self, there's going to be a collision. And this is why Jesus says with such confidence that neutrality isn't an option for us. You can't be sort of committed to the truth. You can't be partially devoted to the kingdom of God. Jesus forces a choice because his claims are absolute. The fire that Jesus brings isn't meant to destroy us, it's meant to purify us. But purification means that the impurities have to be burned away. And that's uncomfortable. And that's what this demand places on us, that we have to be willing to choose the uncomfortable Christ over a comfortable religion. We have to be willing to let this truth create crisis in our lives rather than seeking out a false peace. And in the same way that at some point, there's a certain point at which I had to face the reality that the tooth pain wasn't going away. It became a crisis. We also have to face this reality. We have to face the reality that following Jesus isn't comfortable. And really we have two options. We can deal with that now, we can think about it now, or we can wait until it becomes a crisis that we can no longer ignore. So why do we keep expecting a comfortable Christianity when Jesus tells us explicitly in this passage that's not what's on offer? Well, Jesus diagnoses our problem in the second half of the passage. And I was thinking about, with a sermon, you're writing a sermon, you go, I need a great illustration. Thankfully, Jesus provides a great illustration here for us. It's straightforward. When you see a cloud rising in the west, immediately you say it's going to rain, and it does. When the south wind blows, you say it's going to be hot, and it is. Hypocrites, you know how to interpret the appearance of the earth and the sky. How is it you don't know how to interpret this present time? Jesus is pointing out something that was true of people then and remains true of us now. People are pretty good at reading signs. We can look at the sky and we can predict the weather with remarkable accuracy. It's cloudy, it's going to rain. It's cold, it might hail. The weather's been it's been a bit hot recently. It might continue to be hot. The people then, just as we have now, had learned to read the signs of the natural world. But the problem that Jesus identifies is that they're completely blind to spiritual realities. They can predict tomorrow's weather, but they struggled to recognize that God himself was standing in front of them. Experts at natural discernment, but failing at spiritual discernment. And Jesus calls this out. He calls it hypocrisy, hypocrites, he says. Not because they're being morally evil, but because they're being inconsistent. They clearly have the capacity for discernment, just as we do. They prove it every day when they look at the sky. But when it comes to spiritual things, suddenly they act like discernment is a hard task. It's impossible. Why does this happen? Why are we so good at reading some signs, but so bad at reading others? Well, here's the first reason. We pay attention to signs that don't threaten our comfort. If we're predicting the weather, we're looking at the weather. We might think about the fact that weather affects our plans. If it's cold, I'm going to need a jacket. If it's hot, I don't want to wear too many layers. I don't want to get too hot. If it's wet, I need to dress accordingly. That's how it goes. But ultimately, it's just affecting the comfort of my day. If it's cold, if I'm a bit cold, great. I can stay warm. It feels nice. If it's wet, well, I want to stay dry. It only affects our day. Spiritual truth affects our whole lives. If Jesus is who he claims to be, the adjustments that we need to make aren't just putting on a jacket, they aren't just keeping dry, but they're complete adjustments. Our whole lives have to change. And so what do? We develop selective blindness. This is what the people in the passage were doing. It's easier to read small signs that can keep us comfortable while becoming obtuse about the signs that require big changes. And the second reason is like it. On a certain level, we want Jesus to affirm our lives rather than challenge them. And this is part of what this passage is about. Jesus doesn't come to make our lives work better. He comes to give us completely new lives. It's almost like there's a part of us that we want the personal trainer. We want the trainer that's going to help us get fit. We're going to get fit, but I don't want to do the exercise. I don't want to actually have to put in the hard yards. Or I'm having trouble with my finances. I need to see a financial advisor. But I don't want one that's actually going to make me change my spending habits or actually going to challenge me on the ways I'm using my money. So often we want the benefits of following Jesus without the cost. And ultimately, we often lack the courage to face the uncomfortable implications that following Jesus has. Because even when we see that Jesus is making claims on our lives, even when we can sense that following him will create tension, we choose to look away. Because if we acknowledged what Jesus is really saying, we'd have to do something about it. It's like what happens for many of us when your car's check engine light comes on. We know what the light means, the little light, we know what it means. There's a problem that needs attention. We might not know exactly what it is, but we know we need to get it checked out. We need to get our car serviced. But how do we respond when we get that light? Well, most of the time we keep driving. It's probably nothing serious, and a mechanic is too expensive. I can't justify it. Maybe we turn up the radio. I don't want to hear that weird knock anymore. I'm just going to turn the radio up. I remember driving around my first car, a little old Hyundai Accent when I first got my license. And I discovered it used to rattle and shake uncontrollably when I went above 108 kilometres an hour. So what's the solution? Well, I'm just going to drive it slower than that. I'm just not going to exceed that speed. We do the same thing spiritually. We can sense that Jesus calls us to an uncomfortable obedience, but would rather ignore the signs than deal with the implications. The warning signs are often there. We can see things and we understand what's going on. We know that opening our Bibles is what we need to do. Instead of just bringing them along, we should live out what we say about giving, relationships, forgiveness. We know what Jesus teaches, but to follow through on these things will cost us something. And the result is that we end up living as what Jesus calls hypocrites. Not because we're trying to deceive others, but because we're deceiving ourselves. We're capable of wisdom and discernment in every other area of our life, but when it comes to following Jesus, suddenly we act helpless. We're no different than the people that Jesus was speaking to. We can analyse complicated situations at work, navigate things just right, find just the right path, make sophisticated decisions. But when Jesus challenges us to read the spiritual signs of our own times, of our own lives, suddenly we can act confused. Suddenly we can't figure out, what do we need to do? And this is why Jesus seems frustrated with his audience. You can understand it. You can read the frustration into what he's saying. They don't lack intelligence. They're not dumb. They don't lack ability. They're not incapable. They're using it selectively. And they're avoiding the areas where they need to apply it the most. They, just as we do, would rather live with comfortable dysfunction rather than face uncomfortable transformation. And just like ignoring those physical problems, tooth pain, the check engine light, just as ignoring those makes them worse, ignoring spiritual problems makes them worse too. The tension that Jesus brings to our lives is not going anywhere. The choice he's asking us to make is not an optional choice. It's not opt in or opt out. The fire that he's kindling will eventually touch every area of our lives. And Daniel spoke a bit about that last week, about what does judgment mean. We can face these realities now while we have time to respond wisely, or we can keep avoiding them, kicking the can down the road until they become a crisis that we can't ignore. So that's it. Jesus brings uncomfortable fire. He brings division. We can't handle it on our own. That's where we're at. But there's something in our passage that we haven't looked at yet. Jesus talks about bringing a fire to the earth, but he says something important. I have a baptism to undergo, and what constraint I am under until it is completed. Jesus isn't just bringing fire to us. He's not just bringing fire to others. He's about to go through fire himself. And the word that he uses here for it, baptism, he's not talking about getting dunked in water by John the Baptist. That's already happened at this point. He's thinking about a different kind of baptism entirely. He's talking about being overwhelmed, being submerged, completely drowned in something. And what is it that he's going to be drowned in? Well, we know the truth of the cross. He's going to be drowned in suffering. That's what's coming for him, judgment and death. The very fire that he's bringing to the earth, Jesus is going to pass through it first. And you notice what Jesus feels. He feels the urgency in it. What constraint I am under until it is completed. He's not strolling casually to get there. He's under immense pressure. And Jesus knows that the fire that he brings, this crisis of truth, this demand for us to make a decision, is going to purify people or it's going to condemn them. And ultimately, the thought of it condemning them is too much, and he's going to take the condemnation himself. Jesus perfectly embodied everything that he's calling us to do. Jesus himself experienced the ultimate family division. When he came to start his own ministry in Mark chapter 3, it's recorded that his own family thought he was out of his mind. It says his relatives came to take charge of him because they thought he'd lost the plot after he'd begun his ministry. Jesus knew exactly what it was like to choose obedience to God over family approval. He faced every uncomfortable truth about sin and about what we really deserve. People wanted to make him a comfortable king who would give them easy answers. Even when he was on the cross, he was encouraged, if you really are who you say you are, get down from there, save yourself, take the comfortable path. And yet he refused. He chose the uncomfortable path every time. Ultimately, Jesus underwent the most uncomfortable experience possible. He took the judgment that our blindness, our spiritual blindness and rebellion deserves. The fire of God's wrath against sin didn't bypass Jesus, but it consumed him on the cross. And we can see this play out in the final sort of portion of the passage. In verse 58, it's that warning about settling accounts. As you're going with your adversary to the magistrate, try hard to be reconciled. The judge will turn you over to the officer throw you into prison. You will not get out until you've paid the last penny. And here's the gospel, even if the people hearing Jesus didn't have the full picture yet. That Jesus, in that example, Jesus went to court for us. He stood before the judge in our place. He was turned over to the officer. He was thrown into the prison of death and paid the last penny of what our sin cost. The debt has been settled. And that means that what Jesus brings into our lives now, this fire, is not the fire of condemnation, but it is a fire of purification. Because he went through the fire of judgment, we get to go through the fire of transformation. And this changes everything about how we experience the uncomfortable Christ when we wrestle with the uncomfortableness that we're called into. When Jesus calls us to difficult obedience, we don't have to be afraid that we're earning his love or avoiding his anger, because his love is already secured by his sacrifice. When following Jesus does create tension in our relationships, as we're told that it will, we can endure it because we know that our most important relationship, that's relationship with God himself, has been permanently secured. We don't need everyone's approval because we have God's approval through Christ. When Jesus asks us to face uncomfortable truths about ourselves, we can do it because we know the worst truth about ourselves that we all know, that is, that we're sinners who deserve judgment, has already been dealt with. So when we fail to live up to what Jesus calls us to, and we will fail, we don't have to hide or make excuses from it. We can confess, we can receive forgiveness, and we can try again, because Jesus' perfect obedience covers our imperfect obedience. And this is why Jesus could say it with such urgency, this fire. How I wish it were already kindled, this fire. Jesus is excited, he's keen, but he's not keen on division for its own sake. He's excited about people being separated from the lies that were destroying them. And in this sense, suddenly we realize that the uncomfortable Christ is really the compassionate Christ. And that's the irony of the gospel, that the Christ who seems so uncomfortable, so divisive, so demanding, actually turns out to be the source of our deepest comfort and peace. And it's not the false peace that comes from avoiding hard truths, putting a sticker over the check engine light, but it's the real peace that comes from having those truths dealt with once and for all. And that should be our encouragement today, that when we feel that constraint, when we feel that urgency, that Jesus is calling us towards something uncomfortable, we can respond with confidence. We get our teeth checked. We can deal with the check engine light. Not because we're strong enough to handle it, but because he's already handled the hardest part for us. The uncomfortable Christ has become our comfortable salvation.